My name's Steve Werblow. I'm Secretary General of IFAJ, and we are working on a webinar today with our friend Jefferson Massah. And Jeff, can you introduce yourself? Tell us a little bit about yourself.
I'm Jefferson Massah, a librarian journalist, media trainer, and also a development communication practitioner. I work as a media advisor for the Liberia Media Development Program, and also work in strengthening and promoting agriculture journalists in Liberia. So, an executive member of the Liberia Agriculture Journalists Network, which is the national network of agriculture journalists and rural development reporters across Liberia, especially journalists that have key interests in reporting about the challenges, opportunities, and using a platform to educate smallholder farmers about farming best practices across Liberia. And then we are also uh, an executive committee member of the IFJ, and in 2019, we had the opportunity to be on the visioning committee of the IFJ to develop a strategic plan for the International Federation of Agriculture Journalists for the next 5 years. So um, we come with deep passion for agriculture journalism and communication, and that's another way, especially in developing countries like Liberia. The media can be a help in helping to enhance smallholder farmer information, and at the same time ensuring that they have the access to the needed information to do better farming, to generate income for their family, and also to ensure that we have what we call household food security, as Liberia still considered to be largely involved with what we call subsistence farming, where people only farm to eat, not a very large scale for commercial benefits or maybe profit making. So these are some of the things that we try to do. And then we've been engaged with this for the last more than 10 years now, working with different organizations in helping smallholder farmers have access to the needed information they need to survive and do better farming for their family upkeep.
Tell me a little bit about, you mentioned the idea of sharing information about agriculture and about food security. Of course, the big news right now is COVID-19. What's the situation around COVID-19 in Liberia?
Liberia, among few countries in the Mano River Union Basin or in West Africa that been hit by COVID-19, and we actually got the experience in March. It was the first time that our country reported um, a case of COVID-19, and that was a senior level government official who have traveled to Sweden for an international conference and then coming back, and then he was announced to be the first confirmed case. Uh, and as the result, since then, there have been a lot of cases reported. Up to present, we have like 141 cases now in Liberia, with 16 deaths recorded, um, with over 50 recoveries now documented, and then there are over 80 some more cases, active cases, ongoing for treatment. So that's the current situation. And as a result of that, the government also instituted a lot of measures in helping to curb the further spread of the virus. Among that, the government announced a state of emergency so that they can be able to adequately respond to this epidemic. So currently, Liberia is on a state of emergency. That's we observed the first 2 weeks, and then it was just extended last week to another 2 weeks. So currently, um, we have restriction on the movement of people, um, huge gathering of people being prohibited, and then the government also ordered that the use of nose masks be a mandatory process. So people venturing out in public facilities or in a public should ensure that they have one nose mask to move along with while they get in the public. And then at 15 hours GMT, uh, everyone should be out of the street and be home. So these are some of the measures. And then the government also try to restrict uh, in-country movement, that is disallowing people to travel from one region to another. So, for example, if you are in Maigibi and Massah, which the government earlier considered to be one region because this was these two counties are considered to be the epic center. So people from these areas are disallowed to travel to other regions like in the north central or the southeastern region in order to help curb the further spread of the disease, because the continual movement of people from one point to another, health specialists think that it could be a fueling factor for ensuring this further spread. So these are the measures. And then along with that, the government also saw that if these restrictions are put in place, there should also be uh, measures put in place in addressing some of the consequences. As example, there will be issue of food security, access to basic social services. So the government uh, had a scheme to ensure that people have provided food, though that process is yet to commence, and also uh, in terms of having access to basic social services, the electricity corporation being subsidized, and then water to ensure that people have access to water, electricity as they work from home. So now everyone in Liberia, both government and non-governmental institutions, you have people working from home where you have to do almost everything online or through mobile phone calls, you know, to keep things going. So that's how we are working. So like like you see, I'm at my home office where I'm doing a lot of my work, so that's the current situation. And then there have been massive awareness ongoing, across the country using various media platforms to get messages going out, how people to prevent themselves against COVID-19, which is considered as an invisible enemy. So looking at the devastating impact in the West and other countries. So there too much uncertainty and then apprehension among people about the disease in terms of our own capacity to contain the disease, uh, judging from what the impact is in the West and other countries like China and other countries with all the sophistication, with all the resources, uh, they still find it very difficult to contain. So not speaking about country that just 5 years ago was hit by another epidemic, the Ebola that came in West Africa. And then 5 years later, we are experiencing another pandemic. So there are a lot of, worries and concerns among ordinary people as to how this nightmare will come to an end.
So you mentioned Ebola, and of course the world was watching there too, and that was another horrifying virus. What lessons did you, as a media person and a development person, learn from Ebola, and how are you and your colleagues in Liberia applying those lessons to the current situation?
Yeah, I think the Ebola situation somehow better situated us to be more proactive in terms of, especially when it comes to how the media report, how they handle issues, using credible sources, uh, combating the issue of fake news, misinformation, and disinformation. Because of this upsurge in social media, there are a lot of information on the internet. And how do you verify information and give her the rightful information so that people are informed, you know, in a way that they will not be more apprehensive about or misinformed. So during the Ebola outbreak to emit, it took some time for us to firstly understand the pandemic, because this was our very first time to encounter such a national health, you know, crisis at a very high level with a very huge death toll. So initially, even those in the health sector had problem how to communicate about Ebola. You know, the messaging was not synchronized in a way that people will get, you know, so it took some time. The journalists did not know much about it, so they were very limited. So can you imagine not knowing some about something and trying to inform somebody about it? So you see the challenge there. So as for the Ebola, there were early challenges as to how do we effectively communicate, because we did not understand what it was it. And then there was this huge misconception among the community, because earlier in the early stage of Ebola, people wildly believed that, oh, this was a man-made disease imported to Africa, and then it was intended to get rid of, you know, maybe to reduce the African population and whatsoever. So people saw the health facilities as like, if I if I'm ill and get going at a health facility, it was considered like a death sentence. So we had an obligation to ensure that we educate people that no, getting to the health center much early could help you survive than staying away, or going to the Ebola treatment center, which was created. You could have the chance of surviving than staying away. So that was as a result of persistency and consistency and accurate messaging. People later able to understand that Ebola was real and it was a disease. And then for COVID-19, there's really huge fear among people, because the fear comes from what people are seeing on the internet from the West. So, with, like I said, with all the sophistication, people are seeing, like, for example, in New York, there was this huge death toll in New York as a result of COVID-19. In Italy, the government became very overwhelmed. In China, with all the technology, they saw it very difficult in curbing or containing this further spread. So, in Africa, in Liberia, a country that have a very weak response mechanism, what happens if this virus comes and then spread across? So, so despite Ebola had a very huge death toll in Liberia, but the level of fright as compared to COVID-19, and then for COVID-19, Ebola, you could easily see someone with all the symptoms and know that they are Ebola positive just from observation. But for COVID-19, the symptomatic, you know, signs, they are not of the scene of Ebola. So it makes it very a bit complicated, and then people are more afraid than Ebola because uh, of what they've been seeing and witnessing in the West, and then coupled with huge campaign of fake news, misinformation, and disinformation on the internet. But now I think with the collaborative effort from both the government, NGOs, and other actors, uh, the messaging is more synchronized, proactive, timely than when the Ebola outbreak came in Liberia. So that's the advantage point of it, that we already have a response system. And then as a result of the Ebola, we never had what we call the National Public Health Institute. But for now, lesson learned from the Ebola, Liberia now have a National Public Health Institute, a very up-to-date laboratory system that is now more responsive than the during the Ebola outbreak. So that's sort of the difference. Journalists are media practitioners, are much educated about public health or pandemic than the Ebola. So um, the situation is a bit different from what happened during the Ebola situation, where we had no idea, no experience, not encountering disease of such, but then uh, from the experience gained from the Ebola situation, we try to replicate some of those in helping to combat um, the COVID-19, especially when it comes to the broadcast media, the news media, in helping with information dissemination, especially in rural communities where they heavily relied on radio as their major source of news and information. Uh, those in urban area, yes, they have access to internet and whatsoever, but where you have majority of the population residing in rural communities, they depend on radio because this is a very cost-effective medium of communication, accessible and affordable. And it also promotes the issue about social distancing. And then because this is an epidemic that people, government is saying people shouldn't congregate in huge numbers. So how do you educate people when they are not coming in mass to be educated? So they sit at home, you your mobile phone can easily access an FM signal, and then you can get messages on how to prevent yourself rather than going in a town hall where you get a in cluster situation to get a message how to prevent yourself. So that's how now radio has become so important in terms of going across and helping with information to save lives.
What a tremendous opportunity and responsibility. Um, what tell me a little bit about the role of radio in general in Liberia's urban, or I'm sorry, in Liberia's rural communities. When are the shows broadcast? What are people doing when they're listening? Is this the sort of thing people bring with them to the field, or is it as something that you listen to an evening or a morning broadcast in the house? What kind of relationship does the broadcaster have with the audience?
Radio, not only in Liberia but in Africa, still remain, the major source of information access across the continent. Like I said, internet penetration is still low, not like the West where you have everywhere. Um, so beyond, for example, mobile service providers uh, providing very costly internet services in outside of the capital, uh, radio remains the major source of information for a lot of people across. If might say like 80% of the population, if you do a survey, they will tell you that. Uh, where did you get information about this disease or whatsoever? They will tell you through the radio. So radio remains that. And the radio, like we have over 120 radio stations spread across Liberia. Community radio constituting about 75% of that amount across the country. So they use various radio formats, for example, hosting talk shows, mini radio dramas, jingles, spot messages, you know, news bulletins, these are all radio formats that have been used. And then also using the local languages because radio normally speaks the language of the people. So the local languages being uh, concentrated on. So radio spots are produced in the local languages, which more effective in terms of communicating to rural communities. So you have that. So yes, and then there are cream of rural journalists and reporters being trained how to responsibly report on health issues. So they have like for example, they have a network in Liberia called Local Voices. Local Voices is a team of rural reporters and their focus is to see how they bring real issue at the national level through their reporting, because most often, especially the big media or the national media institution, they mostly concentrate on those in policy making in terms of news coverage. So, and they do not have the time to talk about what the ordinary people think. What are the challenges? What are their issues? So local voices try to amplify issues affecting the lives of ordinary people, mostly from local perspective. So this is a network of mainly rural journalists that go for the ordinary story, telling the untold stories about the lives of the everyday people rather than those in policy making. Because if you look at the national level, bulk of the media, they focus on the presidency, the legislature, the big politicians, the big companies. So local voices try to fill in a gap, going for the missing voices. Most of the talk shows now, they try to rely on mobile phone call rather than inviting them in studio, because we're talking about social distancing and physical distancing. So because of the symptom, people don't know who, for example, I might be sitting with you and then I'm COVID-19 positive, but you don't see any sign that I'm COVID-19 positive. So how do you prevent yourself as a radio journalist against this? So if you want to get, maybe want to know about the current health situation, maybe in your region, and you have the regional health officer, so you're placing a call rather than inviting in the studio to talk to you. So he can talk at length on the phone. It would still represent the scene as being in studio. So that's a shift now. So a lot of talk shows now being conducted via mobile phone. Uh, some journalists also utilizing social media to report. So, for example, WhatsApp can be used to conduct an interview with someone and then rebroadcast that. Even Messenger can also be used to do that, so as to minimizing the risk, because you do not have protected gears most of the station. So how do you continue to report and at the same time keeping safe? So these are some of the strategy that journalists and reporters employ to keep safe and while still reporting.
That makes a lot of sense. With the ability to access information and good interviews, you mentioned the idea of persistency and consistency and accuracy, and of course, you also mentioned social media and viral media, and that can be a breeding ground for all sorts of fake news and misunderstandings and rumors worldwide. How are you accessing information that is accurate, that you can then deliver, persistently and consistently and credibly to your audiences?
The first thing is that in situation of such, you do what we call um, uh, the mapping. You do sources mapping, so you able to identify, for example, at the national level, who do you want to speak to about COVID-19? You need to talk to the Ministry of Health. You need to talk to the National Public Health Institute. You need to talk to the Center for Disease Control. You need to talk to um, the WHO. These are national and international bodies. For example, the Ministry of Health and the National Public Health Institute, they lead the national effort. And then in terms of international support, the US Center for Disease Control and the World Health Organization, they are the lead international uh, support partners to the government. So these are places that journalists, we have a glossary or a repository of data to share with journalists reporting. Then at the county level or the sub uh, regional level, you have what called county health officers, county health promoters. These are people should be the first line of contact when you want to, as a journalist reporting on COVID-19 from the lower level. Or for example, you have what we call district health officer. So if you want to talk to someone about an outbreak in a particular district, the first point of contact should be the district health officer or the district surveillance officer, because these are people that do testing and to know who is COVID-19 positive or not. So we have a directory of not all, but most of those people that journalists have access to to use as sources, gave them credible links. Like, for example, the WHO website, what WHO is saying today about COVID-19, what is the global update? For example, this Center for International Center for Communication in US, John Hopkins,
Ah,
I think the John Hopkins University. So, for example, they have a daily update on global statistics on COVID-19. So, how do you reference such a site in terms of? And then there are other international media development organization, developing training resources for journalists like Internews, Farm Radio International, the International Center for Journalists, and then other organization, Thomson Reuters Foundation. So they're developing a lot of guides for journalists. So those resources, they are pooled and then shared with local journalists. How can they domesticate, you know, the the resources in helping with their reporting? Because you need to have the hard facts, the empirical evidence when you are reporting about these things, and then getting expert information. So, and that you cannot do that in the absence of not getting the needed resources and the needed experts to actually help inform your reporting.
when you've got these national and international sources with the data and the empirical information, what kind of balance do you try to achieve between those high level sources and the local content? You know, is there a mix that you try to achieve
Yeah,
to localize that?
yeah. So you have to localize it, put it into context from the local perspective, because what the CDC might, for example, you are communicating for people to understand. So, for example, the CDC might have some audits, but then you have a lot of technical jargons. So, how do you put it into perspective for understanding? Because you are communicating. How do you communicate effectively for people understanding, especially, for example, in rural communities? So, you have to contextualize it in a way that people will better understand from the local perspective, despite from a global, uh, point of information sharing. But how do you domesticate for your audience? Yeah.
How do you do that? What do you find is effective for bringing these big concepts into context for your local audience?
So, for example, I mean, you in Liberia will have what we call the simple Liberian English. So, if you obtain uh, information from the CDC, for example, no max. So how do you put it into a very simple term for someone to understand? So you say, okay, maybe a piece of cloth that you use, so someone will understand saying piece of cloth, then saying a no mask, situation like that. So that's how, hand sensitizer. So how do you maybe put it in maybe just say soap, hand washing soap, and those sort of stuff. So they will better understand that than you say hand sensitizer. You understand? So that's how, and we've been able to encourage and educate journalists to, put it in the way that people will understand what they are communicating.
And how are you having that communication within the journalism community? Is it through some of these uh, national guilds that you mentioned earlier?
Yeah, for now, for example, we because of the issue of social distancing, we have we use a lot of platforms like WhatsApp, uh, Messenger to congregate journalists, sharing information. So journalists are enrolled to the online platform, like almost like a classroom where mentors, they have assigned mentors, and then people helping to support them understand, because they do not have the resources. They have to do all the research, and have the needed material. So we pull these materials and then make it accessible to them, and then have mentors assigned to them to further educate or guide them in their reporting. So, for example, if someone wants to do a story, you firstly develop what we call your story idea. What do you want to report on? Oh, I want to report on this, I want to report on that. And then, where are your sources? I'm going to talk to A, I'm going to talk to B, and I'm going to talk to C. So, okay, maybe someone will say, what can you add this source to the list of sources? So, that sort of stuff. So it also like a peer learning uh, process, because some will also give suggestions maybe from their past experience. Okay, I did this in my community and this work. I think rather than using this methodology, it's better you go to this. So for example, the issue about talk show. So there were a lot of journalists still hosting people in studio until a journalist came down with COVID-19. So that brought a sense that instead of us bringing us guests into our studio, what can we arrange with the guests and have them calling on our mobile phone and connect them on air? So just, and it came through as an experience sharing from other colleagues, and so that's how peer learning, experience sharing, team building and networking has been the way forward.
That is tremendous. Tell me a little bit more about the mentoring program. Who are the mentors, and how are the connections made with the other journalists?
So for now, the project we work with under the Liberia Media Development Program, we have local media institutions that we work with, and then work with local journalists. So you have, for example, you have what we call the Female Journalists Association of Liberia. Uh, is a network of exclusively to promote female journalism and amplify the voices of women in the media. So under the program, all those female journalists that are part of the mentoring program, they have senior mentors from FIJA that work with them to work on their stories and then guide them in the story production. Then you have who call local voices. They have some senior level journalists that work in rural areas for long, and then now at the national level, they provide editorial guidance and support to these journalists. And then you have other, like the Liberia Media Center, they also, which is the biggest national media development center in Liberia. They have cream of experienced journalists. They also provide mentoring support. So you always assign mentees to experience and more knowledgeable journalists to like a body system, but then you have that to be like their point of contact when it comes to story development, editorial guidance and support.
Outstanding. What a great resource, at any stage in anyone's career. That's
Yeah,
that's phenomenal. You were talking about standard Liberian English, and yet we also talked a little bit about
simple.
simple. I'm sorry. You talked about simple Liberian English, and we also talked a little bit about local languages. Let's talk about that for a moment. How many local languages are in use in Liberia, and how do broadcasters kind of move some of these specialized terms or new concepts into those local languages in a way that's consistent across, say different broadcasts or uh, different broadcasters?
Yeah, we have 16 tribes or local languages spoken across Liberia based on an original location. So, like for example, in the North Central, you have different tribes. Like in the southeastern, you have the Kwa, and then you have the Mende speaking tribe. So, like in the western region, you have the Vai, the Gola, the Bele. These are all local. And then community radio station in almost every major cities across Liberia, you have community radio station, or in almost all counties. So these community radio stations, they are more or like closer to various communities happening, and then help to promote the culture and tradition of, of these communities, because community radio station, they are run by volunteers, and community radio station is a radio station that is owned, managed, and programmed by the community itself. So it means that if a community radio station is in community A, all those responsible to manage the affairs of that community radio station should come from that community, not another community. That's what make a community radio, each community radio, unique to a particular community itself. You understand? So that's how um, the channel, in terms of how to domesticate the information. So at the local level, these community radio stations, depending on the region, they try to put in context what would be better understood in that particular locale as compared to the other region, or maybe the other area.
And so now, are those community broadcasters then part of these mentoring programs, and do they have access to all the kinds of resources you described?
Certainly, certainly. Like currently, the current initiative, it covers the 15 counties of Liberia, where community radio across almost each county, you have a radio station that is part of this initiative.
Outstanding. Now, if I'm talking about a concept, I had never heard the concept or the term social distancing until about March, like most people around the world. And yet, here's this new concept, and it's a specific kind of relationship, spatial relationship. Um, how does that term find its way into Qua, and how do the various volunteers or broadcasters within that area speaking that language bring that term in some kind of unified way, so people are hearing the same term and the same concepts? How does a concept
Yeah,
like that make it into a local language?
yeah. So the first thing is that the National Public Health Institute developed all the approved messages. So people are not inventing their own messages. So the first thing is that if you want to broadcast information about, social distancing, you firstly have to get it approved, because they have a team of message developers that are tasked with developing the message, you know, so that you get these approved messages, so that you have synchronized, messaging across, so people go in and get these messages. So the messages that are now being maybe developed or carried out by these radio stations, these are messages that were approved by the Ministry of Health. And then the only thing that is being done, they're putting it into the local context of the community.
Now, synchronization seems like a really good thing, but of course, then you start to worry about press freedom. Do you have the latitude when you're making that regionalization or localization, to modify those messages in a way that you feel that you're able to bring a free message or an uncensored message to your audiences?
It's not a matter of censoring, but it's the matter of, because this is a message that you want to enhance behavior change. So, and then enhancing behavior change is that you do not want to, and you that may be conveying the message, you are not the expert for this. For example, the CDC is saying it's good to keep a distance, because to avoid droplets and other things coming in direct contact with you, or maybe someone sneezing and then you have a spillover on you. So if you distance yourself from the next person, it will be better than someone telling you that social distancing, even thinking it should be this way. So that, I don't know how does that really directly to relate to censoring, because it's a direct information, scientific base that helping to save life. rather than maybe someone having an opinion on a particular thing and telling, say, no, don't say this way, say it this way.
Got it. So when we talk about approved, we're really meaning that it's been scientifically vetted and validated
Yes.
more than saying you must say this because it's the party line.
No. It's just because of the scientific, and then health specialist, implication.
Sure.
Yeah.
So now let's talk about the role of that rural journalist, that agricultural journalist or rural journalist, in bringing these messages credibly to the listener. Because here I'm some guy at Johns Hopkins, 5,000 kilometers away, saying this is what you need to do. You know, I imagine that I would have some credibility because of my position and my, the role I play in healthcare, but also I'm some guy from outside saying this is what you ought to do. What role does how important is it that the broadcaster be someone who's credible and who has a relationship, an existing relationship with the listeners, when you're carrying information as important and as unusual as COVID-19 information?
Each broadcaster has a constituent. That is why it's better to work with the community radio station within the community that will be able to produce a message. So the community will now be like having ownership. So if, for example, I'm a broadcaster A in this community, that I'm a very popular broadcaster, very lovely. If I'm telling someone, hey, if you love me as your DJ or your broadcaster, keep this distance and don't go. COVID-19 is here. Keep away. People will listen to them because these, especially Europe, these are influencers at their own level. So that's how they've been able to, example, you have some of the radio station, you have a very popular talk show host. So when he says something, even on his social media page, when he just come up to indicate, hey, I am keeping a distance. Where are you too? And, people will follow. So that's how it's been working, because they are not just reporting as journalists, but they are also community stakeholders. That's the uniqueness about community radio broadcasting. So, because these are volunteers helping the community to have access to information, their community believe in it, and then mostly they are not technically sophisticated, in terms of their training and whatsoever, but they're able to convey information to their listeners. Yeah. So now, for example, the issue of social distancing and agriculture. So in Africa, we have what we call communal farming practice. The communal farming practice brings, farmers together to farm for the common interest of the community. So they come in large numbers. So how do you now maintain a balance with social distancing, and then you have to do farming to keep safe, because you need to eat? Because now, for example, in Liberia, almost 80% of what we consume in Liberia, you have to import. We depend on importation from Europe, Asia, and the United States. In these countries, these are the countries that were hard hit by the COVID-19. They are still grappling with, the control process of COVID-19. So what happens if the situation in this country persists? What happened to food security in the midst of social distancing? How do we fill in a gap? And then our agriculture system has heavily been dependent on subsistence farming. So how do we mitigate this in terms of this global health pandemic? China that supply rice, Taiwan, Pakistan, and other countries, we are saying we should restrict, close our borders and whatsoever. So how do we, at the local level, also continue with farming, just maybe, for example, just to feed the family? You understand? And at the same time, maintaining social distancing. So that's a very huge challenge for smallholder farmers, because, and then how do you do your messaging to help encourage them to continue with farming, but at the same time, how can they also prevent themselves against COVID-19 by observing social distancing? Should they reduce the number of people, or maybe do a rationing system where, for example, okay, this week we advise that 5 persons go on the farm, and then the following day 3 persons instead of 20 persons visiting the farm a day. So those sort of a messaging, you know, so there where now the creativity comes in terms of journalists helping smallholder farmers have access to information, how to save themselves against COVID-19, but also continuing with their livelihood, because at the end of the day, rice is not coming from Pakistan or rice is not coming from China. You're no longer getting onion and other things from Holland. You know, you know, you have the pork and other things now. You don't have importation from maybe Bangladesh and other countries. So how do you continue? Yeah.
What are
So
you hearing about that? What is there? Do you think that that this interruption in imports and this threat to food security on a national level may change agriculture in Liberia or West Africa in general?
certainly, because that's what we think. Because these countries that we heavily rely on, they are also grappling with COVID-19. They are also afraid to get in contact because, uh, for example, a European would not want to get on a ship to bring maybe 50 metric tons of rice to Liberia and then return it with COVID-19. So people will be afraid. China is like considered the global epicenter of COVID-19. They supply most of the rice here. Chinese vessels might also maybe, or suppliers might also be very cautious as to how they venture the market or how they move around. So locally, that's why we've been running few articles on our site and our Facebook page. So what can Liberia learn from this situation that have been heavily dependent on food importation from other countries? And then with this global crisis, if this persists, how are we going to address our food security situation in the midst of this global pandemic where it will come a time maybe people will not want to venture out to anywhere. Other countries will have enough to feed, but then we relied on other country importation to fill our population.
So
So
to
how do we develop our agriculture system that will be more responsive to smallholder farmer needs?
And are you hearing any answers to those questions yet? Is there any conjecture
Of
any
recent,
imagination?
yeah, of recent, the government released the Ministry of Agriculture now has what we call weekly update on their own response strategy in dealing with the food security situation. So every week they share that with us, with the media. So, but then uh, having that on paper and also what is obtaining on the ground, these are two things. So you might have a very good strategy, but what is obtaining on the ground, that's another thing. So we'll wait to see how concrete, in terms of the steps that will be taken as it's been written on the paper, to see uh, how it addresses the issue of national food security.
That'll be fascinating. I think that'll be fascinating globally because I imagine every country is grappling with the same concepts.
Yeah.
So that's interesting. Now, as far as the looking forward and looking at how the current situation with COVID-19 is affecting your day-to-day work, working at home, doing more interviews by phone, restricted travel, but yet also needing to have local sources and local context. Do you think that going forward, as these restrictions are lifted, uh, agricultural journalism will change in the future in Liberia?
Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of huge potential for agricultural journalism because let's consider it, agriculture to still not yet gain a rightful place in Liberia yet in terms of the way we farm. Because, like I said, we are yet to maybe migrate or transition to, you know, if not full scale mechanized agriculture, but some sort of an intermediate system that will help further boost up our agricultural system rather than the old age subsistence farming that have not really pay off for years. So as a result, we have heavily relied and on full importation from Asian and Western countries. So with that, if a new approach comes in where firstly agriculture being considered as a priority, there are a whole lot the media can do. And then to present, there are a whole lot agricultural journalism can play in the agriculture sector of Liberia. Because, for example, if you just work with the community radio station to enhance agricultural extension services, because these radio stations, they are closer to farming communities. So if you work, for example, with three, maybe in each county, you work with 4, 5 radio station or maybe 2 radio station, depending on resources availability, and then link them, create a link between the agriculture sector actors and smallholder farmers in terms of information access. What are they doing in the sector? It is not just possible maybe for example, an extension officer assigned to maybe 20,000 or maybe 30,000 farmers. How do you get to them? Even just on a monthly basis, not just possible to get to. But then if you develop radio programs or communication activities, especially using the radio, community radio that are closer to farming communities, it's just a stroke of time. You get to thousands of farmers with farming information that will help them to do better farming, give them up-to-date information. For example, you have a research station that is coming with a lot of research results, new variety of crops. But how is the information being transmitted to farmers? How do they access the new farming information? What the weather information, for example, how do they, in the midst of climate change and other things, how can they be easily guided? How do they change their, for example, their farming practice, for like moving from upland to lowland farming? Utilizing lowland farming where you could maybe farm twice a year and then gain some income for not only to eat, but maybe to also for the family upkeep, what we call farming as a business. So the media has a very huge role that to play in this sort of, for example, in extension services to support, especially for radio. Extension radio is a very successful extension, agricultural extension tool to help smallholder farmer have access to farming information to survive, to do better farming at a very cost-effective, level. Because if maybe the money you might take to drive a vehicle to visit every farm, you could just use less than half of that to have a regular radio program that farmers will follow. They can just use their mobile phone and listen to what you are saying. And, so there are a lot of prospects for agriculture, journalism, and communication in Liberia. Um, but people have to buy in. People need to understand and value the role of the media in our, in agriculture development.
What will help enhance that buy-in, and what will help journalists prepare for those roles, those more technical perhaps roles in the future, do you think?
The first thing is that it requires capacity development. The journalist capacity need to be enhanced. because you need to be informed before you inform. That's the first thing. So the first thing journalists need to understand, grab the concept of what agricultural journalists need and how it impacts smallholder farmers, let's say, because we are, for us, we don't want to look at the big companies because these are people that are looking for profits. So sometimes the big agricultural companies, their action at times even negatively impact smallholder farmers. So they stand at the advantage point, but smallholder farmers stand at a disadvantage point. So if journalists are provided the training, which we are actually being anticipating or being shouting out for support to see how we have more journalists trained, understanding the basic concept of agricultural journalism and communication. So they have the tools, the knowledge, and then they become more effective. So the first thing is capacity development for journalists that will have interest in agricultural reporting. Because in the absence of having the knowledge and the skill, how do you effectively perform? Bulk of our journalists, they are all called, they are engaged in conventional journalism. So how do they transition from conventional journalism to a more specialized focus in terms of agricultural journalism? You need to understand the jargons. You need to be connected to the players in the sector, and that cannot just be done sudden. It's like building up, having the resources, the connection, the skills, and you know, yeah.
What role does your guild, for instance, what role can your guild or does your guild already play in helping create those connections and enhance the understanding and the technical knowledge of the journalists within Liberia?
So that has been our major focus to see, firstly, how do we bring a pool of journalists together with interest in reporting about agriculture. The first thing is to identify people of interest. So if we bring people of interest, and then the next thing is to build their capacity. And then if you build that capacity, if you want to build that capacity, you need resources to make that happen. And that has been our main challenge. But despite of that, we've been with a few journalists that have some level of skill, including me, like done training with other international organizations like Farm Radio, and, in agricultural journalism, like the International Center for Journalism, or the Thomson Reuters Foundation reporting agriculture and rural development training that I have benefited. With those skills acquired from those training, we've been able to like replicate and pass on to some of our colleagues, but not in a very huge, because for the first thing is that the guild does not have the resources that to organize its own periodic training and mentoring program. So that, for example, when we got the minimum support from Coteva to build our website, so now this has served like a motivation for journalists to showcase their work. So they file in reports, and then the next day their report is on the internet. They feel so proud that, oh, I have my work. That's another way of motivating them. And then as a result of these stories, sometimes they have people contact them for training opportunities and others program. So, and these stories, we do not have the resources, for example, to pay the reporter or journalist to travel maybe like 2 days. So they do everything on their own, and then saying a report. So we only use our site to serve as an exposure for their work, so that other people view their work and know that, so for example, if the journalist did a report for FAO or WFP, or so the next time the EFP is having an event, they'll invite you, oh, can you please, we saw your story. Thank you so much. So those sort of stuff. So that's helped to, and then that will keep the journalists connected to the grill that, yes, oh, I'm finding myself somewhere that my work is being share out for people to know what I'm doing.
Um,
So that's the minimal way we are keeping journalists uh, to keep reporting on the sector, while we look for other opportunities that will further expand and enhance what we are doing.
is there anything we didn't talk about that you want to make sure we cover in this webinar?
So I think as we are part of this global network of agricultural journalists, I think as the IFG is transitioning or maybe going to the foundation, I think as we indicated in the vision paper, there's increasing need for more capacity development, because especially in Africa, um, our role will not just be limited to journalism as a national growth, but also communication. That is, um, we don't just want to report on the successes, challenges, or maybe frustration of a farmer, but how do we use our platform to educate farmers to do better farming through collaboration with sector actors. So there where the communication aspect comes in, not just writing the stories, but in return, what are you helping to mitigate or maybe to support using your platform? So, and then we want IFJ to also look at that. How can, especially for developing countries, girls are heavily under resource, do not have the means to see, raise, the needed resources, especially for capacity enhancement on the ground.